Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
We've been talking about the role of self-experimentation in the last video. So can you talk a little bit about how do we get better at experimenting on ourselves, and what is the role of self-experiments in conscious guidance and control?
Yes. Well, the first thing to remind people is that we don't expect our pupils to know how to experiment. It's something that has to be learned. It's a technique. It's not it's not some hidden function of the mind that the person should use. No, it's like every skill. You have to learn how to enter into experiments. You have to learn how to construct experiments. You have to learn to evaluate experiments. We don't assume that our pupils know anything about that. We don't ask them to just could you please experiment a bit more? I've heard things like this, you know, and well, fine. If somebody is not experimenting in the way I'm going to define, it's not because the person doesn't want to or is not I don't know focused enough on exploring the technique, on developing your capacity. No, it's the person has no clue what we mean by experimenting. So experiencing is very easy. Experiencing, you have a lesson with a touch teacher, with any somatic practitioner, and you will be lying down and you will be feeling things and you will experience something. There is no training to. You're not. There is no need to be trained. Well, you may need to be trained to respond as the teacher wants you to respond when he has his hands on you, so that this is it or this is not it. But we are dealing with something else. We are dealing when the moment where the teacher disappears, where the teacher is not there. How is the pupil to organize his life after his lesson? This is the idea. So the first idea was okay. Experimenting is a level of different skills that has to be obtained. We don't expect the pupil to be able to experiment after the first lessons. This is not possible. It's like some people dream that they are going to show a few things and then the pupil will go out and experiment. No, the pupil will go out and find himself once again immersed into his habitual system of guidance, which is somatic, which is according to what he feels. That's what's going to happen. So I need to take a step back just a little bit so that we can circumscribe the theme today. We are discussing experience against experiments, or more, what is a technique of experimenting. And so I start with this idea that there is different notions about why things are the way they are. Why do I have a bad back? Why do I have difficulties with my throat when I sing? Why is it that my knee is really hurting me? There are many different explanations. Why is it that I cannot concentrate? Or why is it that I forget what I wanted to say 2 seconds ago? All these questions need answers, and so Alexander in these schemes provide a very interesting idea. So this is how I start the experimentation. It's by realizing that Alexander has different principles from the habitual principle that without knowing we subscribe to, we use in normal life. Here it is. Let's go. And this is Alexander talking. It's not the young Alexander, it's 1934. So, well, he's already started the first training course and he's writing his his main book, what most people will have read, is The Use of the Self. And he says, I must admit that when I began my investigation, I, in common with most people, conceived of body and mind as separate parts of the same organism, and consequently believed that human ills, difficulties, and shortcomings could be classified as either mental or physical, and dealt with on specifically mental or specifically physical lines. My practical experiences, however, led me to abandon this point of view, and readers of my books will be aware that the technique described in them is based on the opposite conception, namely that it is impossible to separate mental and physical processes in any form of human activity. This change in my conception of the human organism has not come about as the outcome of mere theorizing on my part. It has been forced upon me by the experiences which I have gained through my investigation in a new field of practical experimentation upon the living human being. This is a central part of my interest in the technique. And when Alexander explains that he's got this new conception, an opposite conception to the conception that we inherit in our society, that it is impossible to separate mental and physical processes in any form of human activity, what is important is the last part, is that this change of conception does not come because he's a philosopher. Does not come because he started to talk to himself and create some theory about things. No, he says that it's been forced upon him because he had experiences which were gained through investigation in a new field of practical experimentation. So when you practice an experimentation, of course, you will get an experience. You are part of the experimentation, so your feelings are part of the experimentation. So your feeling mind is going to be, of course, subjected to a new experience. But this new experience does not arrive because you want to have an experience. It's because you're experimenting. It's because you have a certain theory and you want to see in practice whether you can, justify the theory, realize some adjustment, realize some change that is seen to be the direct consequence of the principle you are using. And so the idea that Alexander has done the experimentation, the practical experimentation, and that's it, he's constructed the technique, and so now we are receiving the experience, is faulty. Is completely wrapped from the beginning. I really thought that it was necessary not to experience what Alexander had experienced, but it was necessary to learn how to do the experimentations that had led Alexander to, the new conception of mind and body unity in activity. I really think that many teachers that are talking of mental and physical unity, in fact, are just theorizing. They are just repeating some sort of philosophical ideas, but they don't have the practical experimentation upon the human living human being that Alexander practiced. And because of this, there are many people that think they are really enhancing this model, this new conception, when in fact they are just performing exactly as before on a subconscious basis, on a feeling guidance system, somatic technique, very quickly. So when you read this, it sounds a bit distant from everyday life, distant from people's preoccupation, when in fact it's not, because the surroundings and the interest of Alexander is in movements and their results. And so how do we guide the human organism is the center of his quest, and the habit, the physical habit that we have in sitting, in standing, in walking, in doing something with your hands, playing with a keyboard, in singing, are the very center of his experimentation. It's not an experimentation like in the mind. No, it's very, very practical. So this is the image I posted last week, and I compared what was an experimentation conducted by Alexander on the person of the pupil, and what the experimentation of the modern Alexander teacher is, where it is seen that the shape of the torso doesn't look like anywhere near what Alexander was promoting as a good use of the different parts, of the different movements of the parts of the torso. So he says, now the narrowing and arching of the back, already referred to, are exactly opposite to what is required by nature and to that which is obtained in reeducation, coordination, and readjustment, a widening of the back, and a more normal and extended position of the spine. Moreover, if these conditions of the back be first secured, the neck and arms will no longer be stiffened, and the out default will be eradicated. So again, an example where Alexander is offering a theory, where he says that if the conditions of the back are secured, which is what he's talking about, the lengthening and the widening of the back, the neck and arm, as a consequence, will no longer be stiffened, and the other fault will be eradicated. This is quite interesting because it's exactly the opposite of the modern conception that the neck and head relationship is central and should be organized in such a way that the back could be lengthened. Here we have a completely different theory. So we are forced to experiment in a way, because when you have two sides that are so different and so opposite, and who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the one that says that, the condition of the back are primary, and other people are going to say, well, the condition of the neck and head are primary? Well, of course, you can go by numbers and say, well, there are maybe 5,000 teachers that are saying that the neck and head is primary, and just a few hundreds that are saying that the condition of the back must be first secured so that the neck can be freed. You may think that if a great number of people are saying something, if the whole majority of the modern Alexander technique are saying that the neck and head is primary, you could be safe, on the safe side of numbers. safe side of numbers has never worked in science, has never worked in proper investigations. It's quite possible that many people could follow the same model for different reasons than absolute truth and reliability and correct investigation. It may be that well, it is the way that you can join the group. If you don't think that the neck and head is primary, you're out. So some people may want to belong. That's possible. I do not want to belong in any group, so it's obvious that it's different for me. And so if you want to have a clear idea, to make yourself your own idea, well, you will need to start experimenting. And as I said, it's easily said than done, because how do you experiment with these things? So it can be interesting to observe how an initial Alexander technique, Alexander teach this kind of experimentation, and see if the experimentation that I propose will lead to a sort of form of conviction. Conviction is very, very interesting. Any sound plan must prove its soundness in reference both to concrete consequences and to general principles. We too often forget that that these principles and facts must not be judged separately, but in connection with each other. Further, whilst any theory or principle must ultimately be judged by its consequence in operation, whilst it must be verified experimentally by observation of how it works, yet, in order to justify a claim to be scientific, it must provide a method for making evident and observable what the consequences are. And this method must be such as to afford a guarantee that the observed consequences actually flow from the principle. This is the introduction to Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual, Alexander's second book by John Dewey, and I don't doubt that it has attracted many people like myself. I was really impressed that John Dewey could say something like this of Alexander, and I can tell you that when I arrived in England and started my training course and started to visit other training courses, I was flabbergasted because I could find none of these principles to judge separately the consequences and the facts. When you say that Alexander teachers have the capacity to eradicate the sensory appreciation, so that the movement that are guided by sensory appreciation are going to be, well, good use, so nothing of the sort. It's very easy to check, and so I said to myself, but is this all an heresy, an error, something wrong? And so I had to start experimenting myself. I had to start, I had to go somewhere. My choice was simple. I could either abandon teaching the Alexander technique. At the end of my training course, I had a moment when I said, well, I'm not going to teach this. I don't believe in it. How can I teach it? I've seen so many teachers making people believe that with the hands they could change what they could change was the feeling the person had, that's for sure. They could make such an impression on people's feeling. But when the person was walking around with after a turn with the eyes wide open, a smile on the face, and feeling so light, well, it was quite obvious to me that the conditions of the back were still the same as before, that the person has not improved the coordination of the different movements. And so that was Alexander wrong? Or did we not understand what he was doing? So I had to expand my mind and go further than the Alexander technique, and also before the Alexander technique. And before the Alexander technique, there were people that were working. And so there is a method. It's called the laboratory method of instruction. I did not invent it. I just translated it. I translated it in order to be able to use it. So it's important that you understand where I'm coming from. And so we have this idea of a laboratory method of instruction. So I am a teacher, I teach, and my teaching is more or less constrained by a method, and this is the laboratory method of instruction. So in the laboratory method of instruction, there is a simple plan. The student is taught the principles of the art of experimentation. The instruments and elements are named, the problems are set, and is required to experiment for himself under the eyes and ear of the teacher. Is then shown wherein he fails or succeeds. And Kirby adds, Kirby was a Delsart teacher, or a person really influenced by the Delsart system. And he adds, only as the individual is rich can instruction be made effective. And each teacher as well as student will sooner or later find out how farcical, without supplementary practice given to the individual, is the attempt to treat large classes. And so I wanted to stop a second on the last comment before explaining how I translate the different the 5 points that are included, that are part of the method of laboratory instruction. And because I teach online, I teach a long distance lesson, and very often my readers believe that I give group classes, or I could give group classes. You know, these lessons where you see one teacher speaking and there are myriads of little rectangles where students are listening to the instruction given by the teacher. Well, I do none of the sort. I absolutely not, never. I've already been asked to give group lessons. I've been asked to give a series of lessons, like you know, some sort of scheme where you can book for a whole series of 20 lessons, and which are the same for everyone, of course, and that you must absorb. I do nothing of the sort. It's absolutely impossible, because the point of the technique is not to teach a person to do something, to do something better, to create the correct set of gesture, correct set of instruction, or anything of the sort. The point is to reach the individual reason, so that the individual can create experimentations in order to make up his mind as to the conceptions he or she wants to follow. This means that it's impossible to give a group lesson. This means that it's necessary that what is called here supplementary practice is given to the individual. What it means is that the pupil must be required to experiment with himself under the eyes and ear of the teacher, so that the teacher can, in fact, observe, judge what is seen, and from the judgment discuss with the pupil what conception the pupil has regarding the gesture that is practiced or performed during the experimentation. And when the pupil is going to look at himself performing something where there are clear conditions that are named to start with. We will see what instruments and elements are. Then the pupil can realize whether he is experimenting in the right direction or not. Well, what is experimenting in the right direction? Well, it's very simple. We want here to see whether the pupil becomes capable of translating instructions, theory, into practice, or instruction into a set of actions that have been predetermined, that the pupil must know what is working for, what the instructions are for, and the instructions are for creating indirectly a result. And so, yes, we want to judge, we, the student and the teacher, want to judge whether the actions are the effect or not of the instruction given. It's how the person is capable of translating instruction into action that is of interest. It is what we call discipline. Discipline is the capacity to use instruction and to obey these instructions for oneself, for one's good, for one's advantage. But it's not given that when you give instruction to somebody, the person is going to be able to, in fact, implement the instruction in practice. The experimentation that we are conducing is like repetitive in a sense that the person will discover that at first, well, there are some impediments, there are some problems in the translation of instructions in actions, and the whole experimentation is to discover the means to obtain the result we want. And so there is, of course, an end. There is something to gain. It's to gain the capacity and the confidence in reason, that more and more the person is going to be capable of following not what the person feels, but following really instructions and plans. You are about to, well, change something in your life. You are about to change work, or you have to change work, or you're out of work and you want a new one. Well, it's better to have a plan. It's better to start using the time to your best advantage. With the confinement and COVID and all this, many people have discovered that they had difficulty, in fact, organizing their own time. They were taken by internet games, or by sorts of activities that are not really productive, like watching films all day. You're not planning your future when you watch films. Unless you want to be a filmmaker, which in case it could be part of a plan to watch as many films as you want. But if you are not planning of being a filmmaker, spending hours watching Netflix, for example, is not going to further your quest. So organizing decisions and applying decisions is the center of the experimentation. It's not the physical side. I'm going to talk about the physical aspects of things so much that I wanted to start by saying, well, be careful, because what you're going to see is, of course, people going from seat to stand, but that is just the background. These people that you're going to see are asked to conceive some situation with new words, conceive with new elements, or new instruments, if you want. And of course, for the moment, for what you're going to see, it's all very apparently physical. It is not. It is exactly the same thing as decided what I'm going to do with my time and how am I going to construct in the future something that is beyond me for the moment. We are reaching out for our future. It's not like we are just trying to experience something of a nice nature. We want to feel nice. We want to have a nice experience. Absolutely not. There is no nice experience in the lesson I give. This is absolutely clear. We don't care. We don't care for nice experiences, or if they are, I play them down all the time. When some people say, "Wow, I'm breathing better," or "Wow, I feel so light," well, I say, "Well, this is of no interest to me. I can't feel. You're too far." And you will find that if you feel that now, and you try and base your activities tomorrow on that feeling, you're stuck. You're in the same conceptual bind than before. It's impossible to organize yourself with what felt better yesterday. You have no, well, it's absolutely obvious that the organism will adapt to the new conditions, and what felt absolutely difficult yesterday is not going to feel difficult tomorrow. So if you based your success of yesterday, your success of today on what you felt yesterday, you're going to fail inexorably. It's absolutely clear. So the first element in this idea of teaching experiments is you have to teach coordinating principles. So the first thing Kirby in the list of Kirby is the principles are taught. And so what do we mean by the principles are taught in the initial Alexander technique is a very important idea. So if you want to go to the center, mainly what the center is, we want to teach the means whereby principle and the end gaining principle. These are the principles that are taught to the pupils straight away. And so it's better to stop a second and look at what we mean by means whereby and gaining principle before going further, because otherwise there could be many misunderstandings. I do not agree with the modern definition of the means whereby principle or of the end gaining principle for that matter. I absolutely disagree with both. So it's much better than we start with a clear enunciation of the principle system. So here again, I'm going to share my screen, and if I can. That's the definition of the principles of the means whereby and end gaining by Alexander. This is the only definition I follow. That's what he says. I would point out that whenever a person sets out to achieve a particular end, whether this end is the development of potentialities or the eradication of defects, peculiarity, or misuse, his procedure will be based on one of the two principles which I have called the end gaining and the means whereby principles. The end gaining principles involve a direct procedure on the part of the person endeavoring to gain the desired end. This direct procedure is associated with dependence upon subconscious guidance and control, leading, in cases where a condition of malcoordination is present, to an unsatisfactory use of the mechanism and to an increase in the defects and peculiarity already existing. The means whereby principle, on the other hand, involves a reasoning consideration of the cause of the condition present, and an indirect instead of a direct procedure on the part of the person endeavoring to gain the desired end. The procedure is indirect because after analyzing the cause of the condition present, the person is going to follow verbal instruction reasoned out to produce a general result. So we set out to achieve a particular end as a teacher or as a practitioner of the Alexander technique. We have in mind to change, and change involves two things. They are both quoted here. The development of potentialities, of course. We want to change to develop some potentialities. That's absolutely clear. So something we didn't have before that we want to have after. For example, great memory, a better capacity of attention in situation where we are subjected to strong stimuli and such a things that are normally making us incapable of reasoning because we forget. To reason, you need to have things in mind. Most of the time, consideration means that you're looking at different aspects, different rules at the same time that are not applied in the same conditions. So this is what we call reasoning. If at one moment you're submerged by a feeling of greed, a feeling of anger, a feeling of fear, you're not being capable of reasoning. So your potentiality is going to stay a potentiality because you're a human being. You have a potentiality to really think, but in fact you cannot. You cannot because emotionally, because physically, you are well destabilized, not in equilibrium. So if you don't have this equilibrium, you won't have the openness of mind, which will help you, which is required to proceed, which is required to, in fact, use the words to your advantage. Very many people, they use words to their disadvantage. They observe what they are saying themselves, and they believe what they are saying. So we have the eradications also of these defects, peculiarity of misuse, and the development of potentialities is based on the eradications of defects. We want, for example, there is a great defect that is to always, in fact, apply language to what we feel. It's to talk about what we feel, to think about what we feel all the time. And so I ask a pupil to perform a complex series of performance based on different instructions. And the person is saying, yes, but I feel really contracting. Well, what? Yes, and? Is the technique we are using to decontract? Is the technique we are using to make you feel better? No, at first, any habitual movement is feeling nice. Anything you practice without knowing it all day is feeling normal, is feeling right. Yeah. So if you intend to develop your potentialities, you must understand that you will have to, in fact, go against this easy feeling. Find if there is something easier. This is just the end-gaining principle. A direct procedure on the part of the person endeavoring to gain a desired end. I want to feel better, so I try to feel better. I will find where I can feel better. This is the exact definition of the end-gaining procedure. So the dependence upon subconscious guidance and control. Subconscious guidance and control means simply that you check whether what you are thinking at the moment or what you are doing at the moment, it doesn't matter, or what you are doing and thinking at the moment is making you feel better or not. This is dependence upon subconscious guidance and control. You guide yourself by what you want to feel, and you control whether you feel what you wanted to feel. It's so I teach every single pupil these two principles to start with, and it's not this is the this is what we don't want, dependence upon subconscious guidance and control. No, it's necessary to point out to people when they are engaging into thinking through the principles of engaining. I'm not telling them this is the principle of engaining, that's it. No, I'm pointing in every lesson, more or less, when we are more on the engaining principle method and when we are on the conscious guidance method, which is the means whereby principle, where the person considers that well, there is a nice feeling associated with bad use, and there is a completely new and really sometimes intense feeling of disequilibrium, but we want to check. We want to check whether what we feel is an exact representation of our reality. And well, in that, it's obvious that using what people call the body, that Alexander would not call the body, would call the activity, is going to be of help. So very quickly, we need, as we said, the instruments. The verbal instruction defining decisions of movements. The pupil must be aware of how it is possible to consciously guide indirectly a general result. So look at these images of a student, well, it's a pupil starting lessons. I think it's the first or the second lesson, I can't remember. And I just asked the person to sit in front, to sit and stand, and so I asked the person to stand in front of a chair. And so here is the person standing in front of the chair. In front of her, there is a wall. She's looking at the wall. She's not even looking at herself because, of course, the camera of the computer is set sideways. So the person does not see herself. The teacher does see the pupil from the side. So we have a particular way of assessing the movement of a pupil by very often looking at the side. So at first, well, it's a simple activity. Yeah. But second, we can start to instruct the person about the elements. And so what do we mean by the elements? The elements, you can start to see that we are going to discuss movements, decisions that relate to the movement the person is performing, and the movement the person is performing with different bony parts. So there are spots, as you can see on this picture, and it is easy to instruct the person into finding the bony parts that in fact are represented on this image. And also we are going to discuss some objects that we are going to conceive. To conceive means to imagine, means it's not an object that is under your eye, it's an object that is scrutinized by your own mind. So there are two objects here. There is what we call a rib cage object, and you see it's a form of rectangle. It's very basic. And there is another sort of rectangle. It's the what we call a pelvic object. So the person is seen in activity. And in activity, the person is moving these different objects. So these different objects have anatomical landmarks, where you are absolutely clear that these landmarks are moving in space and time. Elements on it. So when we have the elements, we are going to start talking about the instruments, because the second part of the Kirby is separated into elements and instruments. So what are instruments? Well, instruments are also conceptions. They are not feelings. You know, you understand that the person that is not requested to feel bony parts. The bone has no or nearly no terminal receptors of feelings. The person is not asked to feel these spots. The person is asked to conceive the spots. So at first, of course, I can ask the person to use the tip of an index finger and start poking at the pelvic bony structure to isolate the spots we are talking about. But the person is not to feel these spots. And when we talk about instruments, it's even more remote because, for example, when we talk about instruments, there is one instrument that is always used in the lesson. It's a geometrical instrument where you can establish where is the front of the ankle. It's the bony part on the tibia, on the front of the tibia. And so, as you can see, the front of the tibia is set at a certain distance from the wall in front of the person. And a chair is placed behind the calves, behind the knees. So it's possible to use an instrument that we call orientation, conceptual orientation or conscious orientation. It's asking the person to make, well, decisions that are more like guesses. They say, could you guess how you could stand with the very top of the sternum bone exactly on the vertical of the ankle? Exactly on the vertical of the ankle is an instrument which can be objectified. It's possible to use, for example, a simple wooden stick and measure the distance of the wooden stick to the spot from the wall, and then make another measurement. So in this case, for example, we want the person to start to use instruments to, in fact, conceive the location of different parts in space. So in this case, it is obvious that the person is having the top of the sternum, well, further away from the wall than the lower part of the sternum. So we are starting to establish that the person is making a movement with the ribcage object. And the same with the pelvic object. So the person is making these movements. And so instruments also include representation of a different nature, which are technical. We teach a technique, so the person is not surprised to be, asked to reason technically. And so technically, we say that we have a rigid structure. That rigid structure is rotating around fulcrum. Alexander used the word fulcrum, exactly like the Delsart people. And so in the Delsart system, the pendulum is, the law of the pendulum is in fact a center concept. And so we can say that this person has a tendency to fall forward with the torso. Most of the weight is closer to the wall than the fulcrum. So the person can start realizing that maybe, well, we discuss instruments, and theories are instruments, and we say, well, it appears that there is a movement of the pelvic object, of the bone that we consider here, and that movement is forward of the fulcrum, well, which means that there is a very strong tendency to fall forward. So in that case, to maintain equilibrium, it's obvious that the person has to make a movement which bring the upper ribcage object backward. And when the upper ribcage object backward, this is the reasoning, the upper thoracic spine is set back. So when the upper thoracic spine is set back, any movement of the thoracic spine is going forward and down. When the upper thoracic spine is going back, any movement forward of the cervical spine is going forward and down. We discuss this conception we try to represent what we are talking about so that the person can make a judgment. I'm not even asking the person to make a judgment during the lesson. I'm asking the person to think about it before wanting to have another lesson. If the person, well, refuses and says, no, I can have the upper chest really, Alexander used the expression unduly lifted, meaning unduly lifted, the front of the chest mean that you are, in the sentence, mean that you are in fact shortening the back. You're not lifting the back. The person is absolutely not lengthening the back. It's obvious to me, but not to the person. When the person is standing, she's just standing. She has no elements and no instruments. At the end of the lesson, she should have elements and instruments. So I'm following that, experimental teaching methodology. And so when the person has arrived at that stage, problems have to be stated. If you remember, it was the third point. The problem of obtaining position of mechanical advantage are set. What is the problem of obtaining a position of mechanical advantage? There are two sides to this question, and so I am going to deal with both separately. The first problem is what do we mean by a position of mechanical advantage? And I've been extensive on the subject. For me, obtaining the means of obtaining a position of mechanical advantage is only, in fact, set by F.M. Alexander. I do not regard modern Alexander teaches the position of mechanical advantage as the one Alexander promoted all his life. So for me, this is the first idea. I have a clear idea that lengthening the back is something that can be represented, that can be conceived. It's for me, there is no question that there is an organization of the movement of the lower and middle torso, so that the rib cage object can be organized such that the upper cervical spine and the upper thoracic spine, and cervical spine are directed forward and up from a point. That's what I described last week. The second questions that comes is questions of principle. And that question of principles is relative to the problem of obtaining a correct position of mechanical advantage. It is necessary for the person to understand that what we see as a posture is a result of coordinated movements. The pupil that is coming to have a lesson is already coordinating movements of the different parts of the torso, which leads to, of course, errors, inaccuracies, or misuse, if you want. It's absolutely clear that there is an undue lifting of the front part of the chest. The person is now clear, we are clear about this. There is a shortening of the back, a protruding abdomen, everything is set. For the person, it's a young singer and he's experiencing voice problems and he wants to have a lesson with me. Fine. I will start, well, of course, talking about the principles, naming the elements and the instruments, and setting the problems. And setting the problems is clearly explaining that the functioning depends on the shape. That's, for me, it's obvious. And the shape is a result of movements. So what the person has to change is the movements. The person has to start to represent the movements of the different elements, and the person has to start using tools, using instruments of the mind in order to first conceive and then make the decisions that are going to lead to different coordinations of movements. You cannot change a coordination of movements without starting to create a new coordination of movements. And I am not to create the coordination of movements for the person. I am to just start a process where the person is going to start experimenting with a real capacity to create series of instructions and transform these instructions into action. So at first the person has no idea of what I see, but well, very quickly I can show a picture. I say, I see you like this. I see that the lower part of the sternum is much closer to the wall than your ankle. I see that you are arching. There is a very neat curve, and it seems that the weight of the torso is set forward in such a way off the fulcrum that it's necessary for you to, for the moment, keep your equilibrium and arch the upper thoracic spine backward. This is crowding the voice mechanism. It's a very, very neat case of Alexander was talking about the larynx, and he was talking of a depression of the larynx. To create a depression of the larynx, it's very simple. You get the upper spine, the upper thoracic spine to go back, and you get, well, the cervical spine, the neck, to go forward. In between the two, well, it's obvious that the support of the larynx, the support of the voice mechanism, which is attached to your tongue directly, it's the tongue that is making the tube, is going to be crowded. And hence, you will have all sorts of difficulty with your singing. It's impossible to change the conditions of singing without changing the coordination of the movements of the different parts of the torso. The pupil is, if you remember, the pupil is then instructed to experiment on his own, make his own experiments. And so to experiment for oneself, this is the question. How is the pupil to experiment for himself? Well, the pupil is going to have a certain theory regarding the movements. So any sort of tool can be used. And so look at this image. I'm asking the person to use the strong side of a book. Yeah? And I'm asking the person to place well, like the ruler side of the book against the lower sacrum and lower lumbar. And so the person is making a sort of gesture and setting the book. And the person discovers that he wears the pelvic object in a certain orientation. In standing, it's absolutely obvious that the middle lumbar vertebrae is very far forward of the lower part of the sacrum. I'm going to have the person, in fact, conceive what I call lumbar 3, the middle lumbar vertebrae, and the lower sacrum, and conceive their orientation. One is much closer to the wall in front of the person than the other. Well, this is obvious for me, and I want for the person to have this instrument in mind. This reflects the movement the person is performing with the pelvis in standing. And so in these two images, what you see is an experiment. I'm asking the person to, in fact, incline the torso forward for some reason with the book on the lower back line. And then I'm asking the person to perform what we call a procedure, to perform a gesture. I'm asking the person, could you please, in fact, stand up? And so the person has inclined the torso, first instruction, and then I ask the person, could you please stand up? And when the person is asked to stand up, the activity we can see, and that the pupil realize, is that the proportion of movement of the sternum reference is calculated calculated or compared, for me is the same thing, with the proportion of movement of the lower back line. And what is seen is that the person is to stand, the person coordinates the movement of the lower part of the torso and the upper part of the torso in a very clear way, which is that there is a very, very strong acceleration, unduly lifting the front of the chest and doing nearly nothing. There is a slight change, of course. We can see that the inclination is less, but it's still very much there. It's as if the person is cut in two, and there seems to be no connection between the top, the ribcage object, and the lower sacrum object, the lower pelvic object. The person is just moving one part, and once is constraining the front, and once is constraining the back. Constraining is a word that needs explanation. I will explain to the person that we have a theory. In the initial Alexander technique, it's a theory or principles, or doctrine. Sometimes Alexander used different words. A doctrine of mechanical advantage and antagonistic action. So antagonistic action will lead to antagonistic pulls, and so we consider that the organism is made of two main springs. The main one, the first one, is at the back, and the second one is at the front. So what we observe when the person is performing the action of bending and the action of straightening up is that the person is either releasing one or misusing the other, which means that when the person is lengthening the front, the person is shortening the back, and when the person is lengthening the back, the person is shortening the front. So this is a problem. It is presented as a problem that we want to solve. And so every single experiment, so I'm going to show you another experiment, which is exactly the same with more objects, with more instruments. You will find that here the same person is asked to, in fact, lean forward. So there are instructions to lean forward. The person is asked to locate the lowest ribs on the side of the torso and to locate the very top of the sternum bone, so that the height of the rib cage object is clear in the mind of the person. The person has a very great difficulty in having in mind simple conception during actions that are habitual. Straining up is an action that is habitual. Every time the person straighten up. So, for example, I can ask the person sitting to lean forward and then straighten up to sit upright. Or I have the person being sitting and I ask the person to stand, and standing is the process of straightening up. And so every single time the person performs that gesture, the performance is directed by subconscious guidance. And that means that the person is going to do the coordination according to the habitual feeling. The person knows what to feel when going to straighten up, and the person does. What becomes interesting is to create a competition. So this is what is happening here. We know that the person has an habitual way of straightening up, and I'm starting to request the person to experiment with very deliberate instruments. I'm asking the person to stand up. I want you not to decide not to stand up in the way you normally do. If you don't think about it, you're going to stand up in the way that is shown on the picture and the preceding picture. You're going to accelerate the upper torso so fast that without knowing it, you're going to unduly lift the front part of the chest, protrude the abdomen all over the back. Okay, so we know that. So we want you to use the instruments, and you're going to tell yourself that to straighten up, you're going to move the lowest ribs on the side of the torso backward, and you're going to slow down the upper sternum going back so much that you can, in fact, keep the sternum inclined forward at the top. Fine? This is an experiment. Can you imagine there are 10 pictures? These 10 pictures are done in 2 seconds. I'm asking the person to start counting when he starts the two movements, accelerating the movement of the lowest ribs back and up, and decelerating the movement of the upper torso back and up. I ask the person whether he understands the instruction, whether he imagines what could happen. Person says yes. Go on, experiment. Count to 3, and in 2 seconds we are going to see the result. So what happens then is very interesting to watch. It's, well, if you have the accuracy, if you know what to watch for, what you will find that is, in fact, the person is at first starting to perform as requested, is starting to move very slightly the lowest part of the sternum, of the rib cage backward, yes? But that's what, there is something happening between the first 5, but then very clearly, it's impossible for the person to resist the idea of straightening up, and, well, the idea associated with the somatic guidance, associated with the feeling guidance that feels right to the person, that feels easy. So what is happening is, in fact, the person is reproducing what is always doing despite having received instructions. The person cannot translate decisions into action. There is a conflict. There is a conflict between the habitual guidance and the new guidance. This is not to castigate, this is not to put the blame. This is very interesting. The person must note that there are difficulties transforming decisions into action when these decisions conflict with the habitual use. It's basic. If the person doesn't see this, he may think he's going in the right direction. He's not. It's absolutely clear. So we will see that in the process of standing, the person is leaning forward. Look, when the person starts, image 1, the knees are touching the chair. Image 10, the knees are very far from the chair. So if you look at what has the pelvic object trajectory been, well, it's simple. The trajectory is forward. The person, to straighten up, is having the pelvis go forward. And when it goes forward in such a way that the front of the pelvic object is going down and the back of the pelvic object is going up. The question is, do we want to see this movement? And you will discover in our next episode that no, we don't. We don't want to see that happening. It's a coordination of movements that is not the one required. When the person wants to straighten up, the person is moving the knees. The movement of the knees is not separate. It's not the knees, it's the whole gesture that we consider. And so there are knees forward and upper chest backward. It's these two when the person is capable of conceiving these two movements, knowing that they happen, the person doesn't have to feel they happen, he has to know that they happen in his habitual way of guiding his mechanism, then a possibility of change appears. Do you want to practice these movements again? They make you feel easy, but do you want to feel easy? And the person says, no, I want to experiment. I want to see whether it could be possible, now that I know what is my habitual activity. I can use exactly the same instructions, but I know what I'm fighting against. I'm fighting against my own habitual sense of guidance, my own feelings of what is right, my own feelings of what is easy. Do I want to follow that path? No, I want to try another one. I want to, in fact, disrupt that nice organization, and how to make the instructions effective, how to get the rib cage to rotate the way I plan. I see how I rotate the rib cage all the time. Now it's clear. I see that this model of rotating the rib cage that we have seen in standing is not a standing problem. It's a straightening up problem. Every time the person leans back, which means that the torso is going away from the legs, that's what is happening when we ask a person to lean forward. The torso is inclined relatively to the legs, and standing up is taking the torso angle to the legs greater, making the angle greater. So these movements happens in every single movement of the day. Often I'm asked the question by students about how should I practice during the day. I'm always taken aback by the question. I understand where it comes from. How could a pupil get autonomy from the teacher? Well, it's certainly not by telling the pupil to be autonomous. Please be autonomous from now on. Experiment on your own. At first, the pupil wants to experiment, but well, it's as if the level of conscious guidance is not yet reached. So you have to reach a certain level of capacity of understanding, capacity of initiative, capacity of volition, putting into action some decision you make. So, for example, in sitting, you can decide to incline the torso. I incline the torso. Maybe it's better if I show you what I'm doing, because at the moment I'm performing a gesture, but nobody can see it. So just for a second, I'm going to change view, and I say, how could I experiment? Well, during the day, it's always possible to extend the torso. Nothing is preventing me from. What is this extending the torso about? Well, I'm extending the distance from the torso, of the angle of the torso to the legs, and this is obtaining the means of obtaining the position of mechanical advantage. Sorry. So that's experimenting. I'm experimenting with the movement of the rib cage, with the movement of the pelvic object. I have a clear plan in my mind, and I'm experimenting whether I can or not perform the instructions as required. And the experimenting is going to be complete. For the moment, it's not complete. Be clear about this. When I will set the camera sideways and perform exactly the same gesture and see whether I will see the instruction implemented, so that the movement of the pelvic object and the movement of the rib cage object will be in the right direction. If it's in the right direction, it's a good experiment. Yes, if in the wrong direction and I see it, it's even a better experiment. A good experiment is an experiment where you fail, where you are seen to, in fact, not perform and fail to perform the gesture, because that will set you to think about it and set you to think, okay, how is it clearly that I fail? Do I fail always the same way? Where is the ingredient that is making the fail happen? Is there not a movement that I'm practicing and I don't see, that is in fact making the result impossible to obtain? Most of the time, this is how we perform. This wraps up this presentation, the first presentation, technical presentation of what we call conscious experiments.
Okay, for people watching the video, you'll get a link to Jeando's website underneath if you'd like to book a lesson with him. And thank you, Jeando. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.